Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have a special guest from Sweden, Dr. Per Gustafsson Kurki. He's a Russia analyst at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, and he'll tell us what that is in a moment. And he's here to discuss his fascinating scholarly paper, Putin's military clergy organization, work tests, purpose, and propaganda, which will be the main subject of our conversation today. And it's in many ways a very provocative concept, but we'll delve in that in a minute. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your organization, and how you chose this particular subject?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to already mentioned to the viewers. My name is Per Gustafsson Kurki, and I hold a doctor of philosophy in sociology from Oxford University. I have been an academic scholar for maybe 10-15 years until I decided to do a transfer to civil service in Sweden. So I've basically been in various roles since the 1990s, studying Russia from various angles. I began as a scholar of or a student of legal institutions in Russia, especially the difficulties during the transition in the 1990s. That was the topic of my doctoral thesis. And in more later years, I have been focused on security policy and Russian affairs, international relations, aspects of Russia and its relations to the rest of the world. And in particular, since 2020, I work for the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI, as a researcher and analyst of basically Russian security policy and Russian military capability. So I work in a team of about 12 people. We are currently expanding due to the security situation in the world, especially the Russian invasion of Ukraine since 2022. We are currently rearming in Sweden, and part of that is to put more government funding into our agency, which is a government agency. We work for the Swedish government and provide research and information that is used for policy decisions. So we work for the Ministry of Defense. The team I work for is mostly funded by the Ministry of Defense, but we also work for many other ministries and other agencies in the Swedish civil service. And you also asked me why I got interested in this particular topic, and it's an interesting, fascinating intellectual journey, actually, because when the Russian illegal full-scale invasion of Russia started in 2022, me and the other Russian researchers got quickly realized that we hadn't got everything right about Russian military capability. They did not have the capabilities that we thought that they would have, and they had much worse soldier morale than we expected them to have. Especially in the first year, that was very obviously an important factor, that there were problems with discipline and morale on the Russian side. And the opposite on the Ukrainian side, they were very motivated to defend their country and so on. And no one had expected that either. So basically, I decided together with my co-workers that I should do a study about Russian soldier morale. And in particular, the way Russian analysts military analysts, basically our counterparts on the Russian side, how they conceptualize soldier morale and how they think about this phenomenon and how they perceive it. So what I discovered in that line of work, in that research process, I read the original Russian language texts by these Russian analysts for a couple of months, and I discovered that they were quite often talking about spirituality, and that to me was unexpected. I had not expected to find that. So I was a little bit puzzled first and thought that this must be a marginal thing. But it kept reoccurring in the material. So I decided that I will have to write about that. And that became part of how I conceptualized the Russian, what I call the Russian model of soldier morale. They focus a lot on the role of spirituality and the spiritual characteristics, or the way the Russian soldier has a quality that supposedly is lacking in Western forces, soldiers, that they are spiritual and religious and so on. Basically, my conclusion after making some empirical analysis of that is that it's basically a propaganda concept, because there are not that many soldiers or even Russians in the civilian population that are deeply religious. There are a lot of people, like maybe 60 to 80%, that view themselves as Orthodox in some kind of cultural sense. But maybe 10%, 12%, and that is a longitudinal data for maybe 20 years before the war, full-scale invasion started. Maybe 10-12% regularly visits church services. So my conclusion is that it's more important as a propaganda concept. Religion is more important for internal propaganda and also towards the external world, to tell people that we are very motivated because of religion. But it is kind of a hollow concept. It's not meaningless, it's not without impact, but it's to a certain extent we shouldn't take the Russian propaganda, the Russian description of its value at face value. We shouldn't believe exactly everything they say. So basically, after completing that report, which is called The Russian Understanding of Soldier Morale, it's available in English from foi.se. It can be downloaded there for anyone who's interested. I decided it was important to dig a little bit deeper into this aspect of religion. And that's when I wrote Apostles of Violence, which is a report about the Russian Orthodox Church's role in Russian militarism. And that's where within this report, I was talking a lot about the few numbers, or the limited proportion of people who are actually deeply religious in Russian, but lots of people who are culturally Orthodox. And also I described some material that later became this paper that you have found. So there has been an incremental research process for me, and I've deepened and become got more deep knowledge about the religious component in Russian propaganda, but also stepwise produced various texts. I also written some other stuff as well, but on this topic, and it's something that I will continue to observe in the coming years as well. So that will be it for now about the questions you asked.
So help me understand this. If, as you said, and it completely seems very realistic based on what is the available information, the Russian soldiers are not particularly religious. How would this sort of propaganda work? Why would they be receptive to that? Well, is there some sort of an indoctrination process to change their mindset once they're already recruited?
That's a very valid question, a very good question. And I think that we need to understand that It is true that there are very few that are deeply religious or are strong believers and who attend church services and sort of act on their faith in their daily life. There are, though, a lot of people in Russia who are culturally Orthodox. They would describe themselves as, yes, I'm Orthodox, but mainly in the meaning that, yes, I'm a Russian patriot. I'm loyal, and also today that in the meaning that, yes, I'm loyal to the Russian state, because the state keeps churning out this narrative that we are an Orthodox nation and everyone believes and so on. And that's also an important factor, which I refer to as ambient faith. I think there is an impression that Orthodox faith is everywhere. The president is a believer. Many of the ministers are believers. The patriarch Kirill is an important person who features in news and so on in state television and print media. So you get the impression as a Russian citizen that Orthodoxy is everywhere. So that could also influence their decision to self-report that they are Orthodox, at least in a cultural sense. It's important to signal patriotism and so on in the current context in Russia. But there are also other aspects. I think that you can also see data from the World Value Survey that at least half of the population is generally positive towards the notion of spirituality. So there's also every other Russian would also, without being a believer, would say that spirituality is something that is a positive force. It's something that is important and meaningful for them. So my argument is basically that yes, there is a receptive audience for this kind of propaganda, this kind of militaristic propaganda as it is. And also it can function if we move from the civilian population to the armed forces. I think it's also fully possible to say that that they are also impacted by the presence of today the military clergy, the military priests, the chaplains, and even though they are still relatively few, they are present there in the force to promulgate this message. But then there are also, in addition, a lot of anecdotal evidence I've picked up from various sources. For instance, Ukrainian sources, media sources that talk about the importance of that they perceive from the other side of the front, from defending against the Russian threat, that their impression is that the propaganda is very strong and it's also affected by this religious component to a certain extent, that they see it as well. So I think that it's definitely a complex phenomena. You shouldn't disregard it simply because there are maybe only 1/10 of the population that goes to church, but there are many signs that there is something there that is important for the Russian side, for the Russian state. Yeah, I strongly believe that it's an important topic that needs to be scrutinized further. That's my position anyway.
You say that there is a sort of continuity between this concept and the concept, almost a literary, but also I would say wider cultural concept of the so-called mysterious Russian soul that you can go see going back to the Dostoevsky's writing, and that basically has this anti-materialistic component aimed with a subtle anti-Western hint that on the one hand Russians are distinct from the West, and in particular in being anti-materialistic and somehow more spiritual, and that there's some mysterious component that no one outside the country can fully understand.
Yes, I'm that's a very common way of perceiving Russians, and also among themselves,
Hmm.
way to perceive themselves that way. And again, I think this is definitely a social construction that is worth taking into account. But you also have this famous quote by Churchill that Russia is an enigma wrapped, or a riddle wrapped in an enigma or something like that. But he
Hmm.
also adds that Russia can be understood by its national interests.
Hmm.
So from a security policy perspective, we would take the helicopter perspective on this
Hmm.
problem. I think that there is a rational Russian discourse at some level, but it's framed in a Russian context.
Hmm.
Um, so in a sense, I think that the Russians themselves are a little bit fooling themselves with this mysterious um, perception of themselves. It could be understood as a way of a kind of an ideology as well of
Hmm.
justifying great inequalities in the country and so on. You belong to this mysterious Russian tradition that is different and is more spiritual than everyone else, but we're poor and we have no power over our own lives, but at least we're Russians and we're mysterious. Yay.
Hmm.
So that could be one way of looking at it. But I also think that I think anyone who has spent time in Russia and speaks Russian and talk to them, you can also sense that um, as any people you can visit in the world, any country in the world, they have their specific ways of thinking and so on. But I don't belong to the literary camp, perhaps, that would say that Russians are
Hmm.
uh, typically mysterious and irrational, but I think that they shroud their rationality in particular incentive structures and so on. So while it's difficult to decipher their actions sometimes, I think it's perfectly possible to do so.
It's interesting because the way I see it from your comments, the role of this military clergy is to appeal to the way Russians like to think of themselves, regardless of whether or not they are actually religious. They like to think of themselves as spiritual, regardless of
Mm.
whether even that spirituality is anything real. But this concept, this train of thought, seems to be real enough for them to try to appeal to. It's almost an ego appeal in a way, although you know. Normally, ego people think of something like vanity or ambition, but in this case, it's this sense of a distinctive spiritual appeal. Um, so I'm actually curious to sort of look more at this phenomenon and kind of look at it from a sort of institutional perspective. And I'm curious. It seems to me, based on what I've seen, that there is that this is not a completely brand new approach, that it started in the 1990s but then kind of resurged after Putin came to power circa 2009. would you would you be able to say that there is a different approach in the formal institutionalization of this clergy from the early days of it, and is there, if there is a distinction, what does it say about the differences in Russian approaching the early 1990s versus later years?
Absolutely. That's also a very interesting perspective you put on this. And I would also like to add that the clergy, military clergy, didn't appear only in the 1990s, but it
Hmm.
existed in the Tsar era as well. I think
Hmm.
it was from the early 18th century that it became institutionalized for the first time. It was more informal before that, and it reached its highest point of organizational development during the First World War, when they had, I think it was something about 3,700 military priests towards the end of the war. Uh, and by the way, it's important or interesting to note that despite all these military priests, they didn't succeed in preventing a collapse of the front line and
Mm.
in lack of discipline and morale and so on. So you can question definitely question the objective impact on operational success by the priest. They have some kind of other propaganda value, as we've been talking about and I've been mentioning here. So what happened then? As most of us are aware of, the Soviet Union was an atheistic power. And in the 1920s, after the Bolshevik coup in 1917, there was a fervent campaign, anti-religious campaigns, and many priests were imprisoned or killed even, and believers were ridiculed and harassed in general. But even the Soviet leadership didn't believe that or realize that they couldn't eradicate faith completely. So they were aware that there were many people who still held a warm faith in God of some sort, or usually a Christian God. So when the German invasion of Soviet Union began in 1941, all anti-religious propaganda immediately stopped, at least temporarily. And in 1942 or 43, now I'm not sure about the exact date, I think it was 1942, Stalin resurrected what is called the Moscow Patriarchate. And he did so in a very specific way. He did so by, from the beginning, rebuilding the church, inserting his own people, basically from the KGB into the structures. Some of them were probably or were actually KGB officers that were sent to the seminary to study theology and so on, and then be reintroduced as bishops in the church. There were also bishops that were genuinely believing in God, but they decided to cooperate with the Soviet authorities, perhaps with reference to Romans 13:1, which says that the Christian or a human being, individual, should submit to the powers that be. So, and they might have done it because they believed that this was the only way to preserve some kind of
Mhm.
faith in the Soviet atheistic system. So the church was a very specific type of organization that wasn't a church in traditional sense, and it still isn't a church in a traditional sense, I would argue. It did receive some more freedom after 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved. And there were lots of a grassroots movement of priests emerged, which took contact with local commanders and negotiated contracts for piecemeal contracts for doing religious services in the armed forces. But it was a very piecemeal approach to chaplaincy or military clergyship. As someone who has written a lot about this is the researcher Dmitry Adamski from Israel. This book about the nuclear orthodoxy is a great read. I would recommend it to anyone, in fact. And his argument is that the military clergy did emerge as an informal grassroots movement. And that was the important thing. My argument differs a little bit from his. I would
Mhm.
stress that this informal grassroots movement was still very inefficient in many ways, and it was fragmented. There was no national policy. There were no military command colleges that were educating military priests specifically for service in the army and so on. But this gradually began to change after 2009 when the then President Medvedev decided to resurrect the military clergy after then a 91-year hiatus, so to speak. And then from 2014, there have been 5 military command colleges that have been training this clergymen for service as military priests in the army. So there has definitely been a formalization, and although I don't differ that much from Adamski's argument, we basically reached similar conclusions, and his book is a great read. I would just stress that the formalization of this created effects that would not have been present in the Russian system without the formalization of the military clergy. Yeah.
So it may sound like a silly question, but many Westerners genuinely do not understand this concept. What are the structural and legal contradictions between this military clergy in Russia and the constitutional principle of separation of church and state? Because Russia claims, at least in theory, that they do separate church and state, which is obviously in practice not the case.
Yeah. That's again a very intriguing question, and approaching this topic, I've had great use for my background as basically a social legal scholar. I wrote my thesis at Oxford about the economic special courts, the arbitrage. Basically concluded they were relatively corrupt, especially in the 1990s and so on. People turned to them because they didn't believe that they would necessarily get a fair decision by the judge, but they believed that they could influence the decision with bribes or other informal methods. So it's important to take as a starting point that the Russian legal culture is very different from what would be a typical average Western approach to legality and so on. Formal rules in Russia tend to be less important than the informal understandings, and which is sometimes called panyati. Which is a concept that derives directly from the underworld, the criminal underworld. But this general idea that the law is for your enemies, basically you use the law against people you don't like, who you are competing with, but you don't have to structure your own activities according to the law. And the Russian constitution is an interesting example of that on the macro level, because it's to my understanding of it, it's basically very well written. It's a great constitution. It's just problem is that they don't follow it, and we have the same situation here, that they didn't take seriously. They didn't take it very seriously to analyze the contradictions between the introduction of integration of the military clergy into state structures with the constitution, so to speak, because the military clergy has gained a lot of influence in the armed forces in ways that may actually contradict what the constitution says. So basically, it's a matter of broad Russian legal culture, perception of formality versus informality, and so on. And I think that everyone is aware of the situation. Also, that if the president wants something, there is no reason to believe that the law would stand in his way, so to speak.
It's basically a legalized autocracy in sort of a guise or framework that seems appealing to the outsiders, at least on the surface.
Yes, that might be a way of putting it, yes.
So, moving back to the structural aspect of this, how does this dual-pronged system of oversight, on the one hand, the Russian Orthodox Church, and on the other hand, the Ministry of Defense, shape the function and authority of military clergy? In other words, how does that work? Who coordinates, who calls the shots, and how do they interact among each other and make things work?
Yes, that's an interesting organizational question. I think that the first thing we could note is that there is a structure where they are serving basically two masters. But I would like to say that this is not also, this is in fact it's not a uniquely Russian phenomenon, because chaplains, as they're typically called in the West, or military clergy or military priests, as they tend to be called in Russia. They have in common, in fact, that they both are subjected to the secular laws, the state, in Department of Defense, for instance, Ministry of Defense in Russian case, and also canonically supervised by the church. So in the Russian case, you have the same dual control mechanism, so to speak. And in the Russian case, it is definitely so that you can find military commanders that are themselves not religious, who finds the military priests kind of like free-flying birds that are difficult to control, because they can always turn to rely on the church if they're not happy with directions from the military and so on. So there could be a degree of uncertainty in the relationship there in the organization. Then we also, of course, have the situation with all these informally hired priests that are still present in the structure. Plus the fact that even those priests that are hired by the Ministry of Defense, who pays for their salaries, they have for a long time not had any kind of comparable social protection package, social package from the state compared to the contract soldiers, for instance. They have been much less protected, and their families and so on, if they would lose their lives. So they've had a kind of a bad deal in a sense, which probably affected their willingness to serve. It has been actually difficult to find the right type of priests to select them into the armed forces for many reasons. They need to both have the quality of loving God and loving people, but also love the army. And not all priests are like that, even in Russia. Which actually brings us to another question I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to mention, and it's the as I mentioned earlier, the church itself is not a typical church structure. You have a clear and historical legacy of involvement of the security service, the KGB in the Soviet time, and FSB and other intelligence agencies in Putin's era. So it's not an ordinary Christian church, I would say. But some observers, they make the conclusion that 100% of the clergy is on the boat with this thing, that they are completely 100% loyal and loves the idea of this close connection to the state and the intelligence services. But this is not entirely true. At least it's very difficult to quantify the number of clergymen that opposes this current system, but that they exist is fairly easy to realize, because there are a number of priests who have been and continuously have been reported by sometimes their own parish members, but also colleagues and so on, for diverging from the official narrative of, for instance, praying for victory in the war against Ukraine and so on. That has been a typical point of divergence between the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate and sort of most of the rest of the world's Christian churches. They have been stressing the need for peace, but the Patriarch Kirill has told his priests to pray for victory, which is a very different thing. So speaking about organizational differences, I think that or problems or friction, I think that the military clergy is probably perhaps more homogeneous in that sense. They are selected for having the right values, but clergy in the broader picture, you can probably find those who are have their opinions and viewpoints suppressed by the current system, I believe. So, yes.
That's also a very fascinating point. It's not widely discussed, and there is some sort of a general tendency in Western circles to portray the church as a monolithic institution with everyone basically subjugated to the official perspective. And I think it is worth delving into the so-called dissident priests and
Mm.
or people who are acting a little bit with not in line with official thinking. Um, so, in terms of the challenges arising in recruiting and retaining these military priests, and you refer to some of it, how do factors like social benefits and frontline risks impact this process? Or is it more about ideology than about these very, basic bread and butter issues?
Mm. That's important question too, because clearly the bread and butter issue is very well, much at the center stage of this war from the Russian state's perspective. They spend a huge amount of money to motivate people to join the armed forces. They spend huge amount of money, fortunes, from the perspective of most Russians, if soldiers die and they have still family living in Russia. So this definitely reveals that they themselves do not trust patriotism or orthodoxy alone to
Mm-hmm.
motivate people to fight in this war. But it's very much so that we pay you, you go there, you do your best, hopefully, from their perspective. Um, uh, that's one thing, and it probably, I believe it probably impacts the clergy as well, their choice to pursue a career as a military priest and so on. That's probably an aspect of it, because I think that they are stepwise also making the material conditions better for the priests. They have also recently, I think it was in January, they started to air ideas about dramatically increasing the number of the military clergy from today a couple of hundreds, maybe 300s, 300 to way above 1,000. So that's a dramatic increase, which I'm not sure it has been actually decided yet, but they are at least airing those ideas in policy, highest policy circles in Russia. The churches, of course, supporting the idea. There are voices in the military who also believe that this is an important policy suggestion. But at the same time, again, we're into a very sort of difficult territory here, because although material aspects of life impacts people in all countries, and of course, especially in Russia, where the inequalities are so great, and life can be very tough for many people. But at the same time, you also have this elusive aspect or elusive phenomena of patriotism, and which is in Russia very woven together with the orthodoxy and so on. At least these ideas about spirituality, that is something uniquely Russian or very important to Russians, sort of for their national identity. And I recently saw a very interesting news piece about article about a Russian man who had returned to Moscow with his leg amputated because he had been fighting at the front line, and he was not forced to go fight. He was a volunteer, and he had a decent middle class job before the war in IT, I believe. And he went anyway to fight in the war, and he came back missing a leg. He could have lost his life. And yet he told the reporter that he had tried multiple times to go back, but they refused to have him because he wasn't fully functional. He lacked the leg. But he was very adamant that he wanted to go back because of feelings of patriotism and wanted to defend the motherland and so on. So at least how important this is difficult to measure, I believe. To quantify it, I cannot do. We don't have that kind of data. And
Mm-hmm.
it's merely a matter of noting the details that perhaps indicate that there is something more than just economics, that there are people in Russia. How many there are is difficult to know, but who genuinely believe. They may be fooled by, of course, the internal propaganda during 20 years, which has twisted their minds in many ways. But from their point of view, they with the information that they believe in, they draw the conclusion that they need to fight for Russia and so on. So, and this, of course, is exploited by the Russian state. They are very well aware of this, and I think that the war has not been unwelcome for many reasons for the Russian state, because it's a way of regime survival, and that survival could be granted by waking up the patriotic spirit in the Russian population, at least in those layers that matter, the regime critical people. Then of course there will always be a lot of people who need to be repressed from the Russian state's perspective, because but they need this how to put it, this significant minority perhaps, but still a significant minority that is pro-regime, and if they can tie these old traditional ideas of everything from patriotism, spirituality, orthodoxy, and so on to their own cause, so to speak, and their own propaganda narrative, then I think that is what they have been trying to do, and to some extent succeeded, as it looks like. We don't
Indeed.
know what will happen.
And it seems that the role of the church in general, not just with respect to this specific function, seems to be used increasingly more by the state for various propaganda-linked purposes. And that's kind of where I want to kind of veer off on a slightly theoretical note for a moment. How does institutional theory help explain the creation and evolution of Russia's military clergy? Is it something that fits into the theory, or is it something external?
Um, how do you mean external?
Meaning something outside and unrelated to that theory or that framework, or something that just happened without without the theory being directly applicable.
Okay. I see. Yeah, sure. I would argue that at least that institutional theory has something to teach us about Russia.
Mhm.
Again, as I've mentioned before, I believe that we shouldn't succumb to the idea that Russia is all about mystery, and the
Mhm.
mysterious Russian soul will make it impossible to understand what is going on. I think that is not the case. Um, an institutional theory can help us, but we also need to understand and know the specific Russian facts on the ground. And I think that when a government introduces a law, for instance, they create an institution which funnels resources to a particular cause, and that is true in any country, that enables them to execute possibly effective state policy in some particular area.
Mhm.
In the Russian case of the military clergy, it's important to know that Russia is very much a or can be described as a network state. There is a lot of importance. It's very important to understand the role of informal networks, power networks, as the sociologist Alyona Ledenova has called them. And basically what happens is that the formal positions that are enabled by the decision to launch or resurrect the military clergy, they also functions as, how to say, bargaining chips for those who hold those positions, or platforms for those who hold the positions for informal networking. And it's the informal networks that shape the effectiveness or the activities of the institution. So it is much more informal than in comparable Western countries, I would say. Although, of course, networks can matter also in my country, in Sweden, in this, probably in the United States and the UK too. But it's a matter of degree, not difference in kind. There is a strong component of informality in Russia in general, and also in the power networks that decide the fate of institutions in Russia. So I would say that the institutional theory do have something to teach us about Russia, but shouldn't be taken at face value.
So that brings me to a slightly different aspect of the conversation, because I wanted to delve into some of the concepts that I think are completely out of much of the Western discourse. The United States, for instance, is inundated with Russian talking points, but the deeper discussion seems to evade conversations on this matter regarding religion in Russia or anything else for that matter, which is the concept of the so-called Ruski Mir, Russian peace, Russian and also Russian world could be translated. Also, in what ways does the Russian Orthodox Church this concept of Ruski Mir reflect the elements of ethnophilatism and geopolitical ideology? And how would you actually frame those concepts from your perspective?
Thank you for that question. It's at the core of I believe at the core of the Russian narrative evolving the Orthodox Church and also especially the military clergy. Ruski Mir, the Russian world, is definitely can definitely be understood as a vessel that contains or is used to gather a lot of rather fragmented ideas about nationalisms, about geography, about religious beliefs and politics and so on. And it's definitely not supported by canonical texts. So it is not a purely religious phenomena, but it's very attractive to many Orthodox believers for a number of reasons. It contains some kind of pseudo-historical facts and mixed with the genuine theology that makes it. I think the best way of seeing it is that it may look attractive to Orthodox people, difficult to dismiss for them. But it's a very toxic, I would describe it as a very toxic propaganda concept. And it's unfortunately also a rather successful one because it ties together both the secular and the religious. It leaves room for both Russians who are not very much into orthodoxy or religion to join in this and sort of use this concept. It also is very closely connected to the church. The current Patriarch Kirill, he used it in his inauguration sermon or speech in 2009, so he's been using it ever since very much, regularly, just as the President Vladimir Putin has been using it regularly. And very recently, just the other week, the Patriarch of Serbia visited Moscow and the Kremlin and met with both Patriarch Kirill and Vladimir Putin. And I read the full transcript of their conversation, which is very interesting because the Patriarch of Serbia, he actually proposes or to sort of join the Russian world, and the Russian world is typically defined as geographically defined as Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, sometimes Moldova, and also Kazakhstan. It belongs to this, and also it is extended to possibly extended to it's not a well-defined concept. It's very blurry at its borders, so to speak. It doesn't follow nationally recognized borders, of course, and its focus on Orthodox religion makes it possible for people like the Patriarch of Serbia to say that, well, actually, we want to be a part of this Russian world. This is great for us Orthodox people, and Putin, as he uses very interesting way of putting it. Putin is the trump card of Orthodox people around the world. So there's definitely a political aspect of this that speaks to some kind of Russian soft power. But at the same time, we have the supposedly a member of the Russian world, Ukraine, that is fiercely resisting with armed force the inclusion in the Russian world. So it's not a democratic concept. It's more a totalitarian concept that if you're not willing to join, and we think you are part of it, then we have the right to invade you and try to force you to be a part of it anyway.
So there's a sort of a defiance against this very concept, and not just a unique state level defiance that presents a particular challenge to the Kremlin in that sense. And we have seen that one of the comments recently, he was saying that he once again repeated the notion that the Russians and the Ukrainians are one people, and that kind of seems to harken back to this concept.
Absolutely, and I would like to add that Ruski Mir, the Russian world as a concept, becomes truly toxic when you combine it with the statements in the Russian Orthodox Church document from the year 2000, which is called The Basis of the Social Concept, which is a theological document that outlines the church social teachings and relation to a very number of problems in the world, for instance, war and peace, and so on. And it clearly states there, very, very clearly states that war is difficult to define. There's not a specific war that is defensive, not a specific war that is offensive. They deliberately blurs the difference between these two types of wars, and they say that a war can be justified if it is waged to restore trampled justice, and let's see, what was the other one? Sorry, restore trampled justice, and yes, protect neighbors from harm. And this is together with the Russian world concept, as I described it, the geographical boundaries that include Ukraine, and the metaphysical concepts that blurs the difference between secular politics and religious genuine theology, makes it into a pseudo-theological toxic concept that actually is a blueprint for expansionist wars. And in case of Ukraine, this is exactly the kind of recipe that Putin has used to justify it. He did it on the morning of the 24th of February 2022, when the full-scale invasion was launched. Everything he said there fits into this model very well, actually, and he keeps repeating this. Also, this type of this line of thought is repeated in the narratives, official narrative in the years that follow, and still today.
No, it's funny because this, on the one hand, this concept of the alleged denazification and the alleged campaign to liberate the ethnic Russians from cultural oppression and so forth, this is all tied into the very frameworks that the Soviet Union has set up throughout its legacy by essentially throwing these pockets of ethnic Russian populations into various republics under its control and
Mm,
creating the blueprint that then it could exploit even after the Soviet Union fell apart, officially speaking.
mm. Absolutely. And the legacy of the Soviet Union and Soviet concepts or worldview is very important too, actually, because today or let's start with the Soviet Union aspect. During the Soviet Union, the Russian armed forces or the Soviet armed forces, of course, had something called political departments and political commissars. And basically, they promulgated the Marxist-Leninist worldview that consisted of the ideas such as being beleaguered or encircled by hostile capitalist nations that didn't share the Russian or Soviet values and so on, and wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. Today we have a very similar structure of the argument, but it's theological or pseudo-theological. The military clergy, they say that Russia is similar to Old Testament Israel, surrounded by heathens and pagans, Satanists, basically those who have fallen from, diverged from the true Christian faith, and Russia is the light in this sea of darkness. So I mean, if you compare it with what the political commissars said to the soldiers in the Soviet times, it's of course very different on the surface, but if you dig below the surface, it's the same structure of the argument that Russia always seems to be encircled by hostile forces, and today they even use very strong language and call us basically both Ukrainians and Europeans and others for Satanists, because we are no longer believers. We are more secular nations, and the what Kirill, the patriarch, keeps talking about as the symbol of our divergence from the faith is the fact that we are positive to TQQ rights and sexual minority rights and so on, and we allow gay parades. And a note in today's world that for some people that is a controversial question, but in Sweden we have a very, I would say, a very strong majority. There's a majority of people who believe that this is the right way to do it. This is a good thing. But in the Russian context, you actually do have a lot of people who are suspicious about homosexuality and minority rights concerning this. It ties into, again, that it's not black and white. You can't say that the Russian world concept and the church is completely disconnected from what happens in society or societal attitudes. No, that's not the case, and that's unfortunately so that their toxic views that are actually creating a security threat for Russia's neighbors actually do have connections to actual values or actual attitudes, at least that Russians today hold. Yes, and I mean, to portray your enemy as both as civilians and as soldiers that you're fighting against, as they do in Ukraine, as Satanists and pagans, it kind of is a language that makes it possible to understand how massacres in Bucha and Irpin and Mariupol, destruction of Mariupol and so on, how that could happen when this is the official discourse and this is the official views, that those are not even real people. They have one chance, that is to stop fighting and let us invade their country and occupy their country. That is the only thing that we would accept.
It
So
seems that
killing is okay, almost. It's tolerated.
It seems to me that this dichotomy in the Russian discourse, on the one hand, the Russian roads and the alleged pan-Russian brotherhood in the neighborhood, and on the other hand, if you step out of the line, you are Satanist and so forth. This contradiction, this tension, seems to be ignored by Western analysts and essentially people susceptible to these narratives. They don't seem to see that this discourse is clearly weaponized.
Mm.
But
Absolutely. I I agree that there is a lot of there's a task for us who are studying this phenomena to bring information to the audience. I think it's I mean I can describe my own path to you asked me in the beginning how I
mhm,
decided to study this particular topic and I mean to me I'm I readily I admit that this has been a revelation for me to see how important it is because I hadn't really I have been studying Russia from various aspects for maybe 2 decades, but I think that now when I have spent at least 3 years thinking and writing about the role of spirituality and the church and so on for the armed forces and the society, I have a more nuanced view of Russia, or deeper view, deeper understanding of how things work. Um, because even though, I mean, Sweden, where I live, and I'm a Swede, of course, um, it tend to be it's very secularized country. Sometimes we boast that we're the most secularized country in the world. Um, and this also means that this could probably bias our analysis of a country where spirituality and these kind of uh, values and perceptions are more important and or exist in different forms than in our case. So I see my role currently as someone who puts the searchlight at phenomena that are very important for us to understand as neighbors to Russia, to understand how Russia functions today, and especially as an actor in the international system, very close to us, that has a high appetite for risk and a willingness to use force. Um, and I think it would be foolish not to take into account all aspects of all nuances of how they motivate their strategic choices and so on. So definitely, uh, I think that the importance of this topic will continue to be it will continue to be important.
and what you just said, I couldn't agree more with that. I think it's important to understand how these actions are justified in the arguments that are made and in the minds of the people who are pushing these courses of action. So, to that respect, I want to take a look at the basis of the social concept and the theological doctrines that are outlined there. How do they shape military clergy's approach to war justification, and with essentially how can they use these religious doctrines to first of all to themselves and to their constituents sell the war? Because in Catholicism among Jesuits, there's the just war theory, but this seems
Mm.
to be something different, and I'd like to understand the difference, and I think it's important that others do as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They do refer, I would say that they do refer to St. Augustine's theory of just war in the basis of the social concept. Um,
Mhm.
but they also, and I think that the idea of that they, if I remember this correctly, I think that the idea of the possibility of a blur definition of defensive offensive war might be someone. You have to correct me if I'm completely wrong here, but I think that's the idea comes from San Agustin. But
Mm-hmm.
they have taken really this to home and made it a very important part of their view of their theology on war. Um, and I think that in particular, if we look at the military clergy, the military priests, I mean, they are, as I mentioned before, they're canonically supervised by the church. So the church is basically keeping tabs on them to make sure that they are not diverging from the accepted the theology of the church. They don't take too much initiative of changing things there. And this is a basic document that has been around since for 25 years now, and um, so definitely I think that it shapes it puts the foundation for theological foundation for what the military priests do in relation to the soldiers, the servicemen in the armed forces. I'm not sure if I answered your question
Mm-hmm.
well, but it was. I think this is a. I admit that I find this interesting and important, but it's also a bit tricky. I think I haven't completely mastered all these aspects myself yet, but I write about it in my paper. So I have at least some ideas that I believe are correct and important.
I'm curious, and I think one problem with the first of all, again, as I said, this entire discussion is way out of the mainstream discourse, but to the extent it's ever mentioned in terms of the Orthodox Church and its politicized world, it's for a lot of people it just doesn't they don't understand it because they can't relate to it. The way church works in the United States is altogether different in many ways, at least to people's concepts. Nobody's calling for any wars from the pulpit. There may be a lot excessive politicization from some of the sermons, but you don't have an organized movement of warmongers calling for invasions
Mm.
from the pulpit, in here generally speaking. But so what I'd like to see is how does the weaponization of Orthodox theology compare to similar historical instances where religious institutions have justified or supported military actions? Because, the Crusades come to mind. It's a little bit dated,
Yeah.
but still, of course,
Mm.
the Islamic extremists calling for jihad or during the wars,
Yes.
of Islamic expansion
Yeah.
that were, that also came to mind. So can we compare this current crisis, I would say, with those instances?
Mm. I think it's very valid to make such comparison, and everything that you mentioned seems important or interesting to explore. In particular, this jihad comparison I've encountered before and discussed with my colleagues also at the Swedish Defense Research Agency. Another I think probably less internationally well-known comparison is with Sweden in the 17th century, in particular, when Sweden was a regional great power influential power in Europe, and we fought Russia among other countries repeatedly for many years.
Hmm.
And what characterized those years was that there definitely was some kind of Christian, almost a theocracy. Christianity was a very important founding concept, and also definitely weaponized in ways that you can compare with, that is comparable with the Russian way of using religion today. So Russia is some sense recreating earlier historical forms of military religious relations in a sense. It doesn't seem like an entirely modern phenomena, and we might perhaps also say that jihadism isn't a particularly modern phenomena either. It's also archaic in many ways. It doesn't fit well with our conception of liberal democracy and market economy and freedoms, liberal freedoms, so on. So in that sense, Russia is using old tools to solve problems in the modern world, you might say, and many have drawn a connection to the concept of imperialism in Russia, which is also definitely very important, which also encapsulates the role of orthodoxy in militarism, patriotism, and so on, which also we thought were something that was discarded already last century at least. So yeah, no, that's very interesting, and I mean, although it's difficult today to see that Russia anytime soon would evolve into something more peaceful than currently, and perhaps even something more a democracy of some sort. That is very difficult, honestly, to see that happening in the short term. I think that the demise of imperialist countries in Western Europe nevertheless shows that this transition is possible, but it might not follow the same steps in Russia as elsewhere, and we cannot even be sure that it will ever happen. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and currently, definitely, if we take the case of the military clergy, it's a step towards some kind of old form of military religious relations in the society.
Wow. And I kind of want to delve into something a little bit deeper, because this is something that speaks. There's a lot of intellectual discussions, but I want to take a little bit of an emotional examination, or rather emotional appeal, which is to say, to what extent do theological exceptions within the Russian Orthodox Church's teachings allow for the justifications of aggression under the guise of protecting justice? And we talked a little bit about the Ruski Mir, but that's almost a geopolitical connection to the religion. Is there a specific religious teaching that sort of, in itself, a sort of weaponizing of religion for that purpose?
I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly. Are you?
Is there anything in the Russian Orthodox Church's own theology accepting the external geopolitical interventions and nationalist concepts that kind of that provides a specific allowance for aggression if there is a sort of a quote unquote justice purpose? Is there a sort of concept that you can encapsulate in a word or two, just like Ruski Mir is this doctrine that we discussed?
Well, there is this concept of catechon. I'm actually a little bit unsure about how it is exactly pronounced in English, but catechon, I think, is the right connection, and that is the idea of which has been long-standing idea in Russia, especially in relation to the church, of conceptualizing Russia as a country that is restraining evil, or a shield, being a shield against evil. So this actually is, as far as I understand it, a biblical concept, if I'm not mistaken, and that might speak to your question quite well. And it also, I mean, as I mentioned before, this figure of this kind of ideational figure existed in the Soviet times as well. Then it was the shield against the hostile capitalist countries, and today it's the Russia as the savior of the true Christian faith as they believe that they hold. But I think when you speak about this again, I would like to, when we talk about this topic again, I would like to bring back just remind the viewers that the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate should not be seen as a ordinary Christian church, because of the long-standing, since the mid-1940s, the infiltration of by the KGB, and then close connections with the FSB and the GRU. Even there was recently, actually in April, the Czech intelligence service revealed that a church in Karlovy Vary, the famous spa town in Czech Republic, has been used by the Russian military intelligence GRU for secret meetings to destabilize the European Union countries. Very specific information about this, and the priest in this parish, he was actually the former priest was actually banished from Czech Republic last year because he had been using his religious position to promulgate clearly false narratives, propaganda about Ukraine and also about the West. So and then he lets the GRU use his church buildings for meetings to destabilize the European Union. So it became untenable to have him there. And the local Orthodox Church reacted by transferring their property to the Hungarian Orthodox Church to avoid sanctions from the Czech authorities and being confiscated, so to speak. So this just is one example. We have similar examples in Sweden. There's a Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in the city of Västerås in Sweden, and I would say that it's been very well spotlighted by journalists who have been writing about this in the past few years. The head of the parish priest, for instance, he received not long ago, he received an award by the GRU, the Russian military intelligence. You might ask why they would give him a medal or award for his fantastic work for the GRU. I mean, if you understand the church buildings that he managed to resurrect, by the way, they are funded by Rosatom, the Russian nuclear energy ministry, basically, or company, corporation. So it's clearly state connected. I mean, it's a great success for them. It's about, let's say, half a mile from a strategically important airport. Basically, if you see the church as a potential infrastructure for Russian intelligence operations and information influence operations, then you suddenly see the church as something else than just a collection of genuine believers and theology and liturgy or whatever. And when you see those connections and when you connect the dots, you are forced to change your view, your perception of what this church is all about. It's an amorphous entity. I would say that definitely there are genuine believers in Russia, absolutely, no doubt, among the population. There's a spiritual hunger that has been evident from the beginning of the post-Soviet era. People were starved of religion during the Soviet era, and they turned to church in great numbers. because they suddenly had the opportunity to do so. So I think it's very important to stress that there are genuine believers, genuine Christians, even among the clergy, who would prefer to pray for peace, but they cannot because they might have to endure 15 years of prison if they do, and they are convicted of it. And there are also reports about priests who are telling their parish members critical things about the war and not praying in the correct way, and they are not contacted by the church, but they get a knock on the door, and when they open, there are FSB officers that question them. So the relationship between the intelligence services, the Russian state, and the church have a long history, and they are important for the functioning of the church. So basically, while there might be seeds of something good inside the church, clergymen who are genuinely believing in God and wants to be more like mainstream Christians, the organization, the church as an organization, is clearly in a close relationship with the Russian state, especially the intelligence services, the secret service.
And on that note, I want to turn to a slightly different concept, which is no less disturbing in its own way, and which I'm hearing increasingly from certain circles, though it has not yet entered the mainstream propaganda narrative in the West, even among those who share the view, mistakenly in my opinion, that Putin is the defender of the Christendom and so forth, which is the idea of the Moscow as the third Rome. How did it come about, first of all, and how does it function both as a religious and a geopolitical framework within Russia's state ideology?
Yes, I would describe the relationship between the idea of Moscow as the third Rome as part and parcel with the idea of the Russian world. The Russian world is sort of the umbrella term. That's my view. It is the most general level, the abstract level concept, which, as I mentioned before, it includes both the religious concepts and the secular political concepts, nationalism, patriotism, orthodoxy, and so on, and geography. And also the idea of Moscow as the third Rome. And this is the idea that you have the Roman Empire, where Rome was the first Rome, and then the Roman Empire was divided. It sort of kind of collapsed in its original form, and then Byzance became the second Rome, but it also fell, and Moscow inherited this status. So Moscow is, in this view, the third Rome that, according to their mythology, is eternal, will never fade away. And I think that it might be important here also to say something about the Russian Orthodox Church relation to, and the military clergy's relation to, the nuclear forces, because this is probably the first Christian church that can be described as a nuclear church. They have, since the 1990s, offered the services both to the Ministry of Defense, but in particular tried to approach the nuclear forces, nuclear rocket forces, and they are very integrated there. With their own chapels, their own ceremonies, they bless nuclear missiles and so on. Although it has been controversial, even within the Orthodox Church, there has been dissenting voices. Maybe this is not the best idea to bless intercontinental nuclear missiles. They have actually done that, and you see that in the official propaganda quite a lot. So the Patriarch Kirill has a lot of positive things to say about nuclear weapons, and he has also pointed out that the Russians are not afraid of nuclear war because we are Orthodox believers and we will go to paradise. again, this is some kind of jihadist, almost
Exactly. It
sounding
was
idea. No. And how does this connect to Moscow as the third Rome? Well, the idea, the mythology is that Moscow as the third Rome would never succumb to the pagans or the hordes, the barbarians. It will last forever. And that idea has been around for as long as this concept has been around. So basically, the nuclear weapons are seen as in this worldview, is seen as the guarantor of Moscow as a third eternal Rome. It will make the Russian power, Moscow-based power, eternal, because as they think, at least, it's not possible to. That's a propaganda narrative that they have been churning out throughout the war, that no one can defeat a nuclear power. There's no necessarily a ground to this, but they have successfully promulgated this view, at least, and it ties into this ideological concept of the Moscow as the third Rome, that it will be eternal.
besides these Islamist narratives. By the way, Iran has a very similar geopolitical slash doctrinal intersection, and that may explain why Russia and Iran, despite their vast differences, seem to get along very well on some level. There is another power that was supposed to be the third, but the Third Reich, not the same Third Rome, and this seems to me a very similar sort of thinking there on some level. Isn't there a bit of irony in kind of repeating the same sort of discourse after all the pride that first the Soviet Union and then Moscow have taken in contributing to the defeat of the Nazis, as they claim?
Absolutely, I thoroughly agree with that idea. And I think it was the historian Timothy Snyder who labeled Russian, he called Russian ideology a schizofascism. It's the fascism because it espoused the same characteristics as fascism, but it motivates, justifies itself by claiming to fight fascists. So it's fascists that claim to fight fascists. It's a schizofascism. So yeah, there's definitely, I think, in my view, some disturbing similarities there between historical fascism and today's Russia.
I I kind of want to turn to something else very briefly, which is the geopolitical aspect of all of this before we wrap up the discussion. And the geopolitical security aspects of it. Um, do you how do you see the role of this military clergy approach, and especially what you noted earlier, the rapid expansion? Do you see this becoming a bigger push in terms of Russia's strategy and geopolitical ambitions in other former Soviet states, and also in shaping Russia's approach to hybrid warfare beyond its own borders and into Europe and NATO and so forth?
That's a very interesting question too. I mean, such an incredibly interesting topic in general, and multifaceted, definitely. I think that since there are Russian Orthodox churches in Western or in the European Union and countries like Sweden and UK and Czech Republic and so on, you definitely, as I mentioned, have this potential infrastructure for the use of Russian state to influence and destabilize or whatever they would like to do in those countries. And exactly how this kind of warped theology of the church today, how it would influence this is hard to say. I think that again, I've stressed many times that I believe this is a fairly complex phenomena, but if I would boil it down to something concrete, I would say that the religion is ideologized and used to legitimize Putin's war policies. So basically, I think historically it's fair to say also that the church over the centuries actually has turned out to be fairly flexible in the way they cooperate with the powers, the secular powers, the Tsar and then the and today Putin's regime. So there is a case for saying that the church is merely legitimizes whatever the state wants to do. And if Putin wants to resurrect the Soviet Union, for instance, he would have to attack other countries as well, if that is his intention. We might suspect that it is an attractive idea to him, at least. He's probably considered it, at least. Then I'm sure that the church would find ways to legitimize this. I mean, there has been a bizarre news article that appeared in 2022 after the invasion, a Russian news article, albeit in a kind of a marginal news bureau, but still belonging to the archipelago of state news outlets. That aired this idea that the Swedish island of Gotland, which is in the middle of the Baltic Sea, often described as an unsinkable aircraft carrier where you can sort of put planes and weapon systems or whatever and dominate the Baltic Sea. And thus it's very attractive for the Russians in the case of a war in the Baltics, for instance, to disturb the logistics of NATO. So basically, this news article aired the idea that the inhabitants of Gotland, they were, since they were very briefly occupied by Russian forces in, I believe it was in the, 150 years ago or so, I'm not sure. But since they were briefly occupied by Russian forces, the inhabitants are still sort of descendants of citizens of the Russian Empire. So that would somehow, in a warped way, justify Russian takeover of Gotland. I mean, this is preposterous. It's crazy in all possible ways, but it still follows the kind of recipe for expansion that Russia has had. They cooked up this claim of groundless claim of genocide in Donbass, for instance, as a pretext for invading in 2022. Genocide of Russian speakers in Donbass. Sort of, there has been no credible evidence of that. In fact, so I mean, they do use all tools they have, all create in a very creative way, so to speak. And the church is one aspect of this. I think that in the case of the Swedish island of Gotland, they might have gone a little bit too far there in trying to motivate a takeover, or why it would be, or at least some representative of their propaganda apparatus made that statement some years ago. They might go a little bit too far. I mean, Sweden is today a very secularized country. There's no Russian-speaking minority or sort of indigenous minority. We have immigrants who have Russian as a native language, but not in the sense of Ukraine, for instance, where they have had, and it has been easier for them to use that as a tool for motivating the invasion, so to speak. But the funny thing about Ukraine is, of course, that today nothing has unified the Ukrainian nation as much as Putin's invasion. I mean, today Russian speakers and and Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine are pretty much unanimously against the Russian invasion. So yeah, it's a complex thing, but basically the church is one of the tools that the Russian state can use, and they probably will do as much as they can.
So my final question is to end this on a kind of a broader
Okay.
note. It's sort of two parts, which is the first part being um how does Europe perceive this fusion of military clergy and state ideology impacting Russia's military effectiveness and its perception as a security threat by Western powers, and at the same time, its radicalization? And the second part, how should Western nations and European and institutions address this growing integration of religious ideology into Russian military strategy without reinforcing religious tensions?
Mm. Great questions. I think the first one would be that well, my argument is actually that religion in the armed forces is primarily a propaganda concept. I think that compared to other factors such as the hierarchical relations of coercion in the Russian military is much more important for morale than spirituality. I mean, it's there, but I think that it's fairly on the margin. Yeah, on the margin of things. So it's more important, I think, perhaps or at least to start look at such factors as military culture, even logistics, how the logistics work of the armed forces, because that relates to how well the soldiers are willing to fight and so on. But the military culture, I mean, it erases the soldiers' will to be individuals, even more so than Russian society. Russian society is very collective in many ways. They have a less individualism than I would say in Western countries. But the military culture in particular, from day one, they take people who might be motivated to fight for patriotic or religious reasons, but many of them are, after entering the army, more shaped by the armies or the armed forces coercive structure. So coercion is perhaps more important than spirituality at the end of the day. That would be my argument. I regret that it's difficult to find good data that supports or rejects these hypotheses. It's circumstantial evidence, I would say. That's my argument is based on circumstantial evidence. And the second question on how to respond to this, I think it's very important what you say that, or in your question, that it's important not to increase religious tension, of course, and to do something that is counterproductive. At the moment, I think that from my perspective, at least, I think that the answer to your question is actually a work in progress, because I have been studying this phenomena for about 3 years, and I find it there are so many aspects of it, and I have only studied a select few of them, and I do my best to learn as much as possible about the others as well. But perhaps one way forward would be to, as I've done my best in Sweden to do, is to provide reliable information about how the Russian views soldier morale, for instance, and to inform the militaries about the reality that they probably will encounter this idea in the propaganda landscape that Russian spirituality is so special, it's so important, and it makes the Russian soldier able to outsuffer anything that the Western forces can throw against them. And to realize that this is to a great extent propaganda message blown out of proportion. Even there might be a grain of truth in it, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is that the Russian armed forces is a very hierarchical and authoritarian structure with great problems with hazing, for instance, which is called dedoshina in Russian. So people, soldiers, servicemen, they lose their lives every year due to hazing of their fellow soldiers. So there are many horrific examples of that. So the culture of the organization, the military organization, is based on fear and coercion, and that is more important than theology. The theology is mostly perhaps for the home front, to make them feel that the sacrifices we go through, that all the people who are sent to the meat grinder and the front line, they are not dying for nothing. They're not dying for Putin's corrupt gains. They're dying for God or for Mother Russia or for some other kind of metaphysical entity. I think that would be my answer.
Thank you so much for these invaluable insights, and I genuinely could have continued for a long time more, because this is a fascinating topic, and I hope one day we'll come back to that. But I think this was a very good introduction for those in the West who get snippets of this ideological, theological components from the news and current events, but I think actually taking the political context out of it lends it more value. I think there is a value in the academic understanding of the ideology and the way it shapes shapes the strategy and shapes the approach, and understanding what it is and why it is, and that I think will make for much more informed and grounded policy making, in my opinion, and response. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gustafsson Kurki, and for those watching us, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. We'll be back next week, same time, 9 p.m. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great evening.